I like the friendliness, the choice of location, the balance between theory and empirical work, and the conference dinner, the one yesterday. I tell you, that's one time that you feel bad for your age. You know, I wish I was 20 years younger. But, okay, so what I like to do today is to speak about economics of the supply chain and why it's very important for the environment. I will speak a little bit about my belief that economics has to shift its emphasis from economic of firms to economic of supply chain and innovation, distinguish between innovation supply chain and product supply chain, deal with design of supply chain, and then what are the implications for the environment. Now, how did I get into it? Several years ago, I was asked to be a consultant to a company and asked, God, what do you expect from economists? And you say, everyone can do estimation. We would like you to design supply chain for new products. Now, Berkeley was working for BP and Shell and with Illinois, and the number one challenge is how you design a supply chain for biofuel and for hydrogen. And designing a supply chain for hydrogen is incredibly difficult. And I saw that we don't really deal with it in economic research. It's done by people, by engineers, and they really don't know a lot of economics. So this is a big gap. Now, if I really look at economics, I really think that we are in an era of disruptive innovation. Now, economics was introduced in the 18th century in the rural economy. It was really agricultural economics. A lot of farmers with sheep and goats basically trading in market, and we have the idea of perfect competition and welfare economic. But the modern economy is different. T.W. Schultz basically suggested that traditional systems are in equilibrium, but we are not in equilibrium. There is an important ability to deal with this equilibrium, the distinguish between people. Schumpeter obviously came with the idea of creative destruction. Coase and Williamson realized the notion of the notion of a firm as an evolving institution. And my starting point is that entrepreneur wants to implement the innovation, and he thinks about, or he or she thinks about having a supply chain for implementation. So the question, what will be scale of operation, structure, would you have contract, vertical integration, how you make how you invest, all these issues are important. Now, when we look at supply chain, I learned one thing from Tom Reardon, that supply chain are basically symbiotic. And there are two critical types of supply chain. The innovation supply chain, which does research, patenting, there are several elements. Supply chain go from upstream to downstream, from research to upscaling, and the product supply chain that you basically acquire input, you produce feedstock, you process and marketing, and they evolve. So the relationship is changing all the time. And what I like to do is to speak a little bit in both of them and then to give a little bit of theory. Now, the innovation supply chain, that's something that I have been interested for a long time. And at least in the US, one mode that is very popular is the educational industrial complex. That's basically California. You have universities that make discoveries. They basically give it to startups that develop it, and then companies commercialize it. A lot of the companies are European. So Genentech was bought by a Swiss company. And universities as offices of technology transfer. And so this is one mode of supply chain of innovation. Actually, I helped many years ago to try to design a system like this for Norway and France. The second thing is another approach is what is called recombinant innovation. That some entrepreneur has an idea, and he basically you build a team that use research from different sources and develop a new product. So that's the way that Ford develops a car or Edison develops their product. Nothing new in terms of science, but they took advantage of it. And then there is a third type of innovation supply chain, which is what I call relentless innovation. So if you look at a company like Apple, they all the time improve the product. Or any automobile company, you have new improved product. Sometimes they're really new improved and sometimes not. But that is another thought. Now you have from the economics but now I try to look about a product supply chains. And product, so you have innovation. Innovation is a new way of doing things. It can be a product, it will be a process, it will be an idea where you grow some product, and you basically design a supply chain to implement the innovation. So I will speak about something very simple that I call the two-stage supply chain. Supply chain have very different stages. So the first stage, you produce what I can call a feedstock. That's what engineers call. It's an intermediary input. And then someone processes it to produce the final product. So I'll give you many examples. For example, one example that I love is the production of flowers in Kenya. Someone in Denmark realized that, gosh, you can grow flowers in Kenya all year long without greenhouses. So he went to Kenya, he basically built the processing facility, he helped build the airport. In the beginning, he grew the flowers there, and later on, he started contracting with a lot of other people. And suddenly, you have a huge supply chain of flowers that basically have these two elements, producing power and shipping them. Another example are supermarkets. Supermarkets have all the time a choice between generic product and products that they buy from others. And they have a supply chain that evolves all the time, and all the time the supply chain is improving. Now, in the beginning, many years ago, in the beginning, you have to buy, the seller was beyond the counter. Now everyone can pick up whatever they want. And now you have systems, they bring it to your home. So these are elements of design that are really, really important. A third example is McDonald's. McDonald's, you may not like the product, but it's an incredibly interesting supply chain. It started in Chicago. They basically developed the product, they developed franchise, and their idea was first to buy the land, then build the franchise, and then the building, and then rent it to someone that he will be the franchisee. And they developed one product in the US, mostly in the suburb and outside of Main Street. Then they went to Europe, and in Paris they have store in the middle of the city. So supply chain varies the location. So all these things are economic decisions. They're economic decisions that are dynamic, and I think are really important because especially when it comes to environmental issues, you need to develop new supply chain. We need to develop a supply chain for electric car. We already developed it. For hydrogen, that's one thing that I tried to wrestle with. So we need to understand these things, okay? So generally, so the innovator, whoever has a patent or a right or an idea, design a supply chain. Now, how do they do it? The first thing, they project demand. And they project demand using generally marketers. And marketers use what I call in economic a threshold model. They basically realize that there is a heterogeneity, they realize that there are many market segments, they realize who will be the first people to buy it. And if there is no demand, there is no supply. So supply, to some extent, demand creates supply and supply creates demand. Now, a lot of time, if you don't have demand for a product, the government can create the demand by incentive. We all the time speak about carbon tax. It takes time. I believe it will happen, but maybe 20 years from now. But in the meantime, the government subsidizes Tesla, and you have electric car. Wherever German government subsidizes the solar energy, so to some extent, they create a demand. And when you create demand, something happens. The best example is a vaccine. The vaccine was basically, if the government wouldn't promise anyone that produces a vaccine that they will buy it, it wouldn't happen. Because they have some people that realize how supply chain works. So to some extent, so the first thing you estimate demand, and a lot of time you may create demand. The second thing is the issue of distinguishing between the short term and the long term. So I will develop very sketchy models of all these things, and then we'll speak about some of the implications. So if I look at the short-term supply chain, then you have a two-state supply chain, and you really have to decide how much you produce in-house, how much you produce, you buy from others. And you have several elements, and maybe I'll go directly, maybe I'll go back. So you really, go ahead. I don't know where it goes. So anyhow, so you maximize revenue, which is F times D minus 1. F is a production function, which is the sum of input that you produce in-house and that you buy from others. This is demand, minus processing cost, minus cost of production internally, minus the cost of buying from others. And so these are the basic decisions. You have no negativity. So you have so to some extent, you have several first-order conditions. The first is that the marginal revenue, which is marginal revenue times marginal marginal productivity of input, is equal to marginal processing cost times marginal cost marginal cost internally. Now, when you buy from other, the marginal revenue has to be equal to marginal processing cost plus marginal expenditure. Now, marginal expenditure are generally above marginal cost of production because you take into account that if someone producing more, the marginal cost goes up. So to some extent, when you buy from other and you have some marketing power, you are a monopolist. So to some extent, if I summarize it, the objective is to maximize revenue minus processing cost, cost of production in-house, cost for entrepreneurs. And generally what you do is that entrepreneurs make monopoly and monopoly profit. They try to find a way to diversify production between external and internal input. I have several other papers that have a lot of risk and all the risk aversion, but in principle, you don't need all this stuff. And generally what happens is that if you reduce, increase demand and you reduce cost of processing or cost of production in-house or outside, it will change the system. And there is another thing that you have to recognize, that there are dynamics. So if you're an entrepreneur, you really know that when you start a system, the cost will be very high, and you know that this optimization problem will change as conditions change. So then now, there is another thing that is more important. That if you have an innovative economy, markets are endogenous. Market and product are endogenous. If you look at the product that we have today, they're totally the product. I'm 70 something. They're totally new product when I was a kid. Thank goodness we don't have ice boxes. And so to some extent, you have new product, and whoever is the entrepreneur, at least in the beginning, determine the market power. Then you have entrance, and you have monopolistic competition. But you rarely have perfect competition. Now, there is a guy named Peter Thiel. I may disagree with his political views, but one thing I agree with him, that today, if you look at least in many countries, monopolies are taking a lot of industries, and they don't last forever. Yahoo died, Google was born. I believe that Google wouldn't last. And, or you have several oligopolies that are producing a certain product. Even in Europe, how many companies in Europe that are dominant were there many years ago? And in most meaningful sectors, you have some market power. And the reason that you have market power is because the fixed costs are very high, and a lot of it is and investment are very risky. And at least from my experience in the US, I was working when I was young with some venture capitalists. There are incredible number of failures. So we really have an economy that these are some of the situations. Now, this is the standard Abba Lerner middleman. That basically, if you're a middleman is a monopoly in the output market, a monopoly in the input market. And the monopoly makes tons of, the blue is a profit. Basically, the price to consumer is much lower than the price to producers, and there is a big margin. There is a company called Apple that fits this model very well. And if you look at the many industries, you have the same type of stories, that you really have a situation that companies, because they have a new product and they may be patented, protected by patent or by specific knowledge or exclusive supply chain, they develop this type of stuff. Even in agriculture, where we are moving to a situation that the competitive model is not paramount. It's not that it's not important and antitrust is not important, but we have to realize that that's the way the world works. Now, so a lot of time you have to decide how you design supply chain. Do you have a vertical integration? Do you have contracting? Do you have a situation that is called nucleus plasma, that the processor also produces the input, like a lot of wineries? They produce a lot of grape, but they grow their own grapes. You have the centralized system you buy in the market. Another issue is credit. It is really important. Then we have risk. Intellectual property is important a lot of time. For example, companies wouldn't use contractors in China because they are afraid that someone will steal their idea. Or even if you look at it, Apple used Samsung as a contractor, and now Samsung is their biggest competitor. So there are all this issue. Now, if I look at the dynamics, you have to make investment all the time, and I develop a standard model of investment, and to some extent, basically you have maximized net present value of investment when you have capital affect the cost of production and the cost of processing, and the optimal level of capital it replaces the marginal cost of capital and the marginal productivity of capital, and generally the marginal benefit of capital depend on the projected future investment in capital. So what you realize is that that if you start with limited amount of capital in the beginning, you invest in capital, then you may make money. The volume of operation may increase over time. And I've been in a paper with Ruslana, we introduced learning by doing, so the cost goes down, but also because you invest more. If you have capital goods that increase feedstock efficiency, you basically are able to increase the capital. Now, if I try to play with the model further, there are different countries, so you move from one country to another. There are elements of foreign direct investment, so you can really see how supply chain move from one place to another when you adapt, and then when you move from one country to another, you have to ask yourself, do I use a local partner, or do I bring someone from my own country? You have to take into account regulation. If you want to build biofuel in Brazil, you know that you cannot own it. So this is another thing. So you can take the model, you can have a three-state supply chain and many more. But generally speaking, supply chain have multiple stages. In every stage, you have to decide what do I do and what do I buy from other. Dynamics are important, and one key element is there are externalities. Now, one key element in supply chain management is finance. Generally speaking, especially in the beginning, if you don't have finance, it's very difficult to operate, and there are different types of sources of finance. Generally, at least in the US, a lot of times the basic research is supported by government and the foundation. Development is supported by venture capital, and upscaling by hedge fund, and then production by bank. Now, if you don't have a financial system that allow to bring companies, you're in trouble. Now, whatever people say about Michael Milken, he might have been a criminal, but he invented junk bonds. And junk bonds are fantastic because they allow a lot of startups to operate. So to some extent, understanding finance is very important to economics. A lot of time when I speak with students, they go, what about credit? Oh, this is finance. Finance is economics. And as I said before, supply chain involved, there is a learning and what I call related innovations. And a lot of time you need to have multiple supply chains to operate together. For example, if you want to produce hydrogen, you need to have a supply chain for hydrogen, and you need to have a supply chain of machinery that is using hydrogen. And this is really a real product. And you need a supply chain for distributing the hydrogen. God, this is really difficult. How would you do it? And that's one of the reasons that we really have a hard time adapting to climate change. Everyone call it upscaling problem. The upscaling problem is the design of supply chain problem, and this is really difficult. Now, another thing about supply chain is this element of adapting and pivoting, because this is very important. You may have a supply chain and there is a shock. Now, we call adaptation, business people call it pivoting. If you look, pivoting become very important. I thought it's only in basketball, but in every area of life. So for example, if you look at the pandemic, the pandemic was incredibly unbelievable success story, especially in agriculture. People couldn't buy food. Restaurants now start using software to keep food at home. A lot of time, farmer will send directly to consumer. And it's not only in the US, it's in India and other countries. And there were a lot of, the PDAC and Dixit model is very useful because people may have an innovation and they don't really implement it because they wait to the right time. And what happened in the pandemic, especially in China, because they were crazy in terms of their closing the economy, there was incredible movement to digitize the food sector. So to some extent, supply chain adapt all the time, and a lot of time, early innovations that were in the background are brought forward. Again, the pandemic is a great example how things like this happened. Now, what does it mean in environmental economics? So to some extent, you really need to have a lot, the impact of climate change is not limited to consumers. There is a huge literature, to me, much of it is of limited value, that's my view, about how climate change will affect farmers. My friend in Berkeley thinks that the world will fall apart, farmers will die, there will be no food. I personally don't think that will be the problem because there will be new areas. We have a lot of technologies. If the environmental community would allow a little bit of GMO and other things will be better, and generally we can get much more of our land. But on the other hand, I worry a lot of time of what would be if supply chain have troubles, then it will affect producers or consumers. The migration of production is not bad because you introduce a new vintage. Let's see what happened to Germany after Second World War. But if you have a situation like when we have during the tsunami in Japan and you cannot ship a product, or when you have a hurricane and you cannot reach a development country area, you may have fantastic agricultural production, but you don't have enough food. So to some extent, resilience include also resilient infrastructure, include diversifying producing, improve relying on multiple sources. The other thing that is even more important is the chicken and egg problem. When you try to design new systems like electric car or sequestration of plants by algae or climate resilient program, you basically have you need more than one supply chain. Hydrogen is an incredible example. You need to have a hydrogen source, you need to have equipment that use it, you need to have a mechanism to sell it. As I said before, if there is no demand, there will be no supply. And that is the reason that a lot of time government need or someone need to develop, to try to develop some source of demand so people will start invest. If you look at the hydrogen business, there are about 3 or 4 places that people invest because there are some incentives. They invest in California because of renewable fuel standards. They invest in Texas because Texas subsidizes it. They invest in Europe because they hope to get some subsidies. But to some extent, you really need to have some mechanism that assure you that someone will buy your product, and otherwise it would. So we need to realize it, and a lot of time when we look at the system, we say, gosh, carbon tax is nice and it's essential, and I believe it will happen, but when it will happen, it will be much less needed than now. But even with carbon tax, a lot of time, if you don't know that you have a buyer, you won't do it, and you don't have that you have guarantee credit, you won't do it. So these are things that are not straight 18th century economics that we have to have in our analysis. Companies need credit and no one provided. My first paper, I assumed imperfect credit market and sent it to AER, and it was rejected because it's stupid. Of course, everyone knows that credit markets are perfect. Then Stiglitz came. So to some extent, we really need to know that we live in a world where we have to take into account credit, and we have to take into account the fact that a lot of time, if you have a new idea, we need to find a way to subsidize it. Other thing that is very important is the issue of circularity. When you develop a supply chain, you always have externalities. But if you don't take this, if businesses don't realize that you have these externalities, then you have pollution. And to me, again, you have to think, how I develop mechanism that would allow you to have supply chain and make regulation that makes the life of supply chain very easy. So, for example, there is something called the black soldier fly that it digests a lot of junk and produce at the end protein. Now, it can evolve. A supply can evolve very fast or very slow. It depends on regulation, and this is tricky. Now, regulators, generally speaking, on a precautionary principle to make sure that forever and ever and ever there is no risk. And you know, scientists, if someone writes a paper, you discover another risk with very low probability. If you are an investor, you wouldn't do it. So you need to develop a mechanism that you look at expected benefit and cost with some risk premium, etc. And you need to know that regulation has to occur within a certain amount of time. If you want a circular economy, it wouldn't happen if you cannot introduce this circular product because it takes 27 years to introduce a product, and no one will build the environmental supply chain, even though they have a green hat, if it will take 27 years. So now, supply chain are not only for, I have a type, are not only for businesses. Like water system are supply chain, and you have to understand how they operate. I have a little paper that I really show that, let's say in California, the water system basically is run by the government and non-governmental organization. And it actually, there is sometimes excess supply and a lot of subsidies. In India, in certain cases, the people that provide groundwater have a monopoly in some cases, and they control the supply and production. So again, when you look at the water system, you have to look at it as a supply chain. And when you design a water system, finance matters, and all the issues of how you get the money, who will make the money, what about the credit, it's supply chain design like anything else. If I look at NGOs, they are basically, they are a supply chain. They need to make money. They have to think how you can make, what's the product that we build, how to make the money, how I convince a crazy millionaire that I will for him, and so I support a regulation that totally doesn't make sense economically because some crazy person will give me $10 million. Again, these are issues of supply chain that we need to understand. So the same issues, what is the product, what is the supply chain, what is the input, and I think a lot of great things are done by NGO, a lot of bad things are done by NGO, like anything else, but we need to see it not as a firm, but a supply chain that has upstream, downstream, midstream, finance, etc. Now, so as I said before, modeling of economic analysis, you really need to look a lot of stuff, the role of supply chain and how things are linked, how different markets are linked, not to take the market as given, but to take market as something that comes and go. And the other thing is to recognize that monopolies are not always bad. The key, in my view, is that you have to have mechanisms that allow entry to the system. A strong academic universities and strong startup system can in many ways kill monopolies. Regulations that are used by monopolies to prevent entry are very problematic. To me, these are the very, very important things. Another thing is the issue that we need as economists to use life cycle analysis and to understand it. It's not perfect. Every discipline thinks that other disciplines are rigorous and stupid, and etc. But that's what engineers are using. They use life cycle analysis. And it's a very powerful tool. We need to find a way to incorporate it in our analysis and know what's going on. Because if we don't incorporate it and consider it nonsense, we will consider it nonsense, and someone may write papers that how stupid it is, but policymakers will use it. and the world will be influenced by it. So to some extent, it's really, really important to understand supply chain, to understand life cycle analysis, to understand all this stuff. And the other thing is we need to be multidisciplinary. I think that generally speaking, what happened is because we all the time suspect that other disciplines are not rigorous, we always overestimate things that we get for them. And of course, some studies by engineers exaggerate some stuff, and there are lack of prediction. But we need to understand what we do so we know what works and what doesn't work, what process works. They know that, for example, adoption will take some time. And so if they give a prediction that you will have 90% saving, it's not tomorrow. So we need to understand how they come to and work together rather than fight, because what I find, at least in the areas of environment that I work, that our power, at least in the US, is declining because we don't play nice with other disciplines. So I think that is another important. So what are my conclusions? First, that the educational industrial complex is a very important element of innovation. Universities are part of the innovation process. We need to encourage research that results in commercial product. It's okay that professors start companies. Once you become rich, become a donor, stop being a professor. The technological innovation create new markets. A lot of times they are not competitive. Markets are endogenous. The magnitude of the supply chain depend on innovations. And we really need to accept that monopolies care. That in environmental economics, we need to realize that externalities and everything are part of supply chain, and we need to incorporate it within, to understand it in corporate policies within the supply chain, and then it's very easy to teach undergraduate Pigovian tax. It's much more complex to say when you interfere, what are the flows of information, what are the challenges, who is doing what, how I can tell you 15 stories, how, for example, a legal system prevents you from taxing the right person. So we really need to understand how things happened. Another thing is to understand how you respond to shocks. And I think that once we do it, we will become much more relevant. I have a list of papers that I have in this area, but on a personal level, I think that we have a really opportunity in many ways to reinvent a lot of what we do in economics and be less isolated and more relevant. Okay, thank you.